Contemporary context. In this video I would like to discuss some of my samples and take you through the process of materials, visual qualities, physical qualities, scaling and the feelings. These samples are from my independent project, which then led on to a refinement process for my presentation project. In this sample we can see the material quality and the technique. The materials that have been used are an array of coloured threads, matchsticks, and I dissected a seed pot from a garden centre, which was then cut up, reassembled, and this gave me a very, very structured, three-dimensional, movable sample. The colour palette is very, very bold within this project, and this allowed me to experiment with all aspects of colour. So what this engaged with the samples was a very, very visual concept. Now, looking at the reverse of the samples always generates a point of interest. This allowed me to achieve a slightly rawer finish on one side, and then on the frontage of the sample a more polished, more aesthetically pleasing sample. Again, we can see the qualities of the colour palette, the qualities of the structure, the qualities of the back, and the qualities of the frontage. What these samples have actually allowed me to do is to play with scale. Now, some of the samples went larger, some of the samples went smaller, but with the three-dimensional aspect and construction of the sample, I was able to engage in larger scale, medium scale and smaller scale. And as we can see, the sample actually compacts down, producing something a lot smaller. Moving on from that, I moved away and made another form of three-dimensional structure from the remainders of the seed pot that had been used. The seed pot was made from paper mache, which enabled me to paint, cut up, dissect, reconstruct and stitch. Again, we can see that these samples are very movable, very flexible, and at this point started to give me the ideas of putting these samples in a context. Again, we can see that I played with various dimensions of construction, continuing the flow of application of painting and stitching, but what this did encounter was each of the samples were very, very different. Again, you will note that the three-dimensional quality of the sample did give me a playful experimental aspect to these samples. Now, because I wanted to place these samples within a context, each of the samples became very different in their shape, their form and their structure. This then enabled me to start to engage with looking at the body formation of how I could place a sample, possibly across the breast, possibly on the shoulder, or possibly on the chest. These developments then allowed me to look at various shapes and form of the samples, and due to the scale of the samples, started to give me connotations of a basque, or something that could fit around the waist of the body. Proceeding further with the areas of refinement, which I do have a tendency of to make too many samples, too many ideas and too enthusiastic, I took the feedback from my tutor and started to move more into the realm of refining these ideas by collating them together, picking out what worked and picking out what didn't work, what I liked and what I disliked. Moving on, I then came up with reducing the colour palette down and started to reduce down the amount of materials that I was going to use. I wanted to work with the materials that I enjoyed the most, which was thread and wire, and the three-dimensional quality of the reconstructed pot that has enabled me to make the three-dimensional qualities of the samples. Within this sample, I then refined it and reduced the colour palette merely down to one colour, which was the woolen colour of the winter coat from Paul Smith. And then I hand stitched this, reconstructing with wire, but still maintaining the quality of a three-dimensional structure, which would then enable me to still place the sample within a context for fashion. Playing around again with more of the colour palette, I then decided to reduce down my colour palette by playing with coloured threads, still with wire, and then taking the connotation of concrete. Hence, this is why the sample is painted white, so that then the colour palette became minimal, but then still became very, very detailed. Again, you can still see that the sample quality is very, very three-dimensional, still with the element of placing around the body, across the breast, onto the shoulder, which then gave me a connotation to refine even further of how I was going to use my samples in a fashion context. These would then initially be played around with fashion illustration, photographed, producing a collection of the samples that had originated from assignment 5 to progress on to final number 6 for the presentation of the samples in the form of a mood board, a presentation of a slideshow, and a refinement and quality of the work that I wanted to achieve.